Good morning, everyone. And with apologies for not being able to be there live with you today, I hope the recording is a reasonable facsimile. Let me go ahead and get things set up and we can get this started. Um, so I'm going to continue this week with the theme that we started a week ago, which is building a better economy. And I know that there's a lot going on in the news, and I will be returning intermittently to those themes, but I do think that this is one of the really most important themes facing our society today. And so today I'm going to focus, having a little bit of a review and an amplification of some of the themes we talked about a week ago, on, in particular, the transition from the New Deal to neoliberalism and how it is that we understand the New Deal. And there will be a debate, and the debate will be between those who basically view the New Deal as uh, ambiguous success, that it just got things right, and that in a sense what we need to do is to try to figure out how we can rebuild a new deal for the 21st century. And there will also be critics who suggest that not only did the New Deal not get everything right, but in many ways neoliberalism grows directly out of the weaknesses of the New Deal. So that's where we're headed. I managed to get a better image of Diego Rivera's Detroit Arts Institute, Detroit Institute of Arts, in Detroit Industry mural, and this idea of a collectivist, cooperativist, heroic treatment of the worker as a contributing member of the society, the idea that we're all in this together and that workers have to be valued for the important work they do, and then the contrasting image from Goya of what inequality does to society, the kind of hierarchy that it builds, and what it's like to live in a society in which people are fundamentally not cooperating, but instead hierarchically related to each other. We've spoken about, both in this context and the context of the forthcoming trials of the former president, the eroding trust in major institutions in the United States. They're at an all-time low, the abysmal trust level in the federal government. And I've suggested to you that one of the roots of the eroded trust is the failure to establish a fair economy that respects both the freedom and the agency of individual citizens and workers, that this is a significant contributing factor. It's not it alone, but it is an important part of the reason that our institutions may not be up to the stress test that we're asking them to perform right now. I suggested also that we have very low trust, in particular in the courts, that more than 2/3 of Americans believe the courts really serve the interests of the wealthy and not the rest of them. And when we look at the federal government and policy as a whole, there's good reason for that suspicion, right? And we can just look at the tax code as a clear exhibit in the case to be made that federal law, state law, and the decision-making apparatus of the federal government, including the courts, has been highly biased or skewed in favor of the wealthy for many decades now. The consequences of that skew are seen in our distribution of income and wealth, the very unequal and skewed distribution of income over the last 40 years, the way in which this has rendered a substantial portion, basically 50% of the American population, economically vulnerable, trying to live on $30,000 a year or less, and also the human effects of this, particularly seen in the epidemic of deaths of despair, especially among white working class people who lack a college education. Those, of course, are the people who are most inclined to mistrust the major institutions of our society and to throw in with a party that has become an anti-mainstream populist party, trying to undermine the institutions that form the infrastructure of our democracy. I have pointed out to you that within recent living memory, we have done much better, that the mid 20th century gains in equality in both income and wealth both set the expectations for future generations. We will continue to do what is required to create a more equal and middle-class society, and also then make it clear that if we fail to do that, it's not simply an act of nature. This is something we have done successfully in the past, and we could choose to do successfully at present, and so that anger and grievance are justified. I'm going to amplify these themes a little bit by focusing on the aftermath of the 2007-2008 economic crisis. And I want to start by suggesting that there was plenty of culpability in major American institutions, especially banks, in the way in which they issued mortgages, in their failure to do due diligence, in their peddling of dangerous subprime mortgages, and more generally in their use of a shadow banking system to offload debt, which created much greater systemic vulnerability than our regulations were inclined or built to handle. And one way that we see this is that the largest banks operating in our economy, and right here we can talk about Bank of America, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, all worth hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars, all received fines in the multiple billion-dollar range, and yet no one, I take it back, exactly one bank executive was prosecuted for the malfeasance that gave rise to this economic crisis. That fits very well with the recent book by Trevor Jackson, Impunity in Capitalism, The Afterlives of European Financial Crises. He covers the period from 1690 to 1830, and he suggests basically that this is the model, right? This is not an anomaly. Actually, what's an anomaly is the savings and loans crisis of a decade earlier, but those banks were small, and the crisis did not result in a general economic crisis. When there's a general economic crisis, even though often the financiers are responsible for it, we don't prosecute the financiers. We don't hold them accountable for the damage they've done, because we're relying on them to restart our economy. And if we start going after them, the worry is that they will not assist us in regenerating the liquidity the economy needs to function. So this is Paul Pelletier, and he was a long-term federal prosecutor, worked for more than a quarter of a century, and he resigned in the aftermath of the 2008 economic crisis over the failure of the Department of Justice to prosecute any of the high-level executives in the banks. He felt it was legal malpractice not to do so. I will just point out to you briefly that there was a financial crisis inquiry commission that recommended 11 separate criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice acted on none of them, right? William Black, who was looking at the savings and loan crisis and comparing it with the 2008 crisis, notes that there were 30,000 criminal referrals in the savings and loan crisis and almost none in 2008. Robert Kuttner, a really influential economic historian, sums this up in a recent article. We live in an age of selective application of the law, in which influential people often evade responsibility for actions that are or should be criminal, while minor offenders such as shoplifters or drug users can face prison terms. Impunity is fundamentally inconsistent with democracy. I would add, inconsistent with the principle of equality under the law. During and after the financial crisis of 2008, the degree of structural impunity in the US was pervasive and startling. And so then we ask, what did this crisis do to Americans? And here, I think we transition from income to wealth. And what we see is that the aftermath of the 2008 crisis further skews the unequal distribution of wealth in the United States. Everybody suffered, right, from 2007 to roughly 2013, but the richest 10% did not see as large a decline in their wealth, and then they saw a much more rapid and complete recovery to the point where they're doing better than they were in 2007, whereas the remaining portion of the population saw their wealth take a much more dramatic hit and never really recover. To just break this down a little bit further, right? The top 90% have seen a 13% increase in their wealth. And then as you go down the wealth ladder, each rung further down is more negatively impacted, to the point where the bottom 25% of the population is down 37%, the median household down 30%, and we know why this is. 10 million Americans lost their homes. Millions more saw the value of their home vastly eroded when this asset bubble collapsed. And for middle-class Americans, their home is their primary store of wealth. It's what they invest in typically. For the most affluent, yes, they own homes, and so they took a hit, but they are also invested in stocks, bonds, other assets, mutual funds, etc. And so they have a more diversified portfolio, and they were less vulnerable. Their wealth rebounded much more rapidly and completely. We put this in the context of overall economic inequality in the United States. I like this diagram as a visualization. What you can see is that 1% of Americans own 40% of the wealth of our society, 10% own 80% of that wealth, right? If you go to the top 40%, you're now up to over 90% of the wealth being owned. That means the bottom 60% own only less than 10% of the wealth, right? And what you can see is that 40% own basically 1% of the wealth. On this diagram, that red dot is Austin, Texas, right? That represents what 40% of the population owns, as opposed to 1% who own 40 times as much. And so the economic crisis of 2008 occurs against a backdrop of severely unequal distribution of wealth, and it exacerbated that primarily by undermining the wealth of the least wealthy people in our society. Again, the unfairness, the anger, the grievance, the sense that the banks were too big to fail, the bankers were too big to jail, and yet everyone else was forced to bear the costs of the risky and perhaps criminal bank behavior of the bankers. I think underlines a lot of the anger, grievance, mistrust in American politics today. in seeking to explain and give a more analytic perspective on this, I pointed to a number of works. What I'd like to do today is spend just a minute more with Katerina Pastor, who has done some of the very important legal analysis of this. She is a professor of contracts and private law or commercial law at the University of Columbia University here in New York. And she has spent a couple decades training corporate lawyers. And I kind of view this as a kiss and tell. This is her indicating how the lawyers that she has trained have rigged the system of private law to be a system that creates incredible wealth for rather few individuals while shifting risk onto the rest of us. So what Katerina Pastor suggests is that ultimately capital, right, assets that can be used to generate profit by investing them, tends to be legally coded in a way that sets it apart from other assets like ordinary homeowners' homes, right? And we see this. The banks did not lose their assets. The homeowners did lose their assets. And she suggests that's not accidental. That's because of the way in which the law is used to insulate assets that function as capital against loss. Whereas ordinary people don't have access to those high-powered lawyers, can't code their assets in that way. The law does not permit them to, and therefore they're on the hook when the economy takes a downturn. She points our attention to administrative, contract, property, tax, trust, collateral, and bankruptcy law. And these are areas of the law that are so-called private law, often commercial law. And among the features that she calls our attention to is that they're highly complex. Try reading your credit card contract, right? And then imagine that on steroids for the average commercial contract, for instance, for a mortgage-backed derivative. They're also very technical. The complexity and the technical nature of them go hand in hand. They're doing things, in other words, that the rest of us really can't understand. You've got to go to Columbia and get a law degree specializing in commercial law to be able to make sense of these contracts. And the result is that they're opaque, right? That the rest of us really don't understand what they're doing. And by the way, that very often includes the members of our Congress, our legislators, the political officials who might hold these actors to account can't penetrate the complexity and technical language of the contracts they use. And then two more features that are really important, that this law is indeterminate and malleable. And that is important because what it means is that the contracts can be extended to incorporate more and more assets, that whether we're talking about property law or trust law or bankruptcy law, more and more assets can be tested to see if they can be brought into the class of assets that receive this special coding and protection. And then note that this is not done by statute law, right? This is not something that Congress passes. This is done via private law, by the drafting of contracts, the signing of contracts, primarily by lawyers representing private actors, and then upheld by judges, right? And so the question here is how do we regulate this? How do we control this? And Pastor's suggestion is that we're in a period of drift where this area of law is moving very quickly into new areas of assets, and the rest of us are merely spectators to this because it is essentially unregulated. The final thing that she points out is that although all of this is private law, My lawyer negotiates with your lawyer. You and I sign a contract, right? No public law was made. It never went through Congress. But if we have a dispute, if you default on the agreement and I decide I've got to sue you to get it enforced, we're using the courts and state power. Ultimately, if I win, I may get a lien on your assets that the government is going to help me to enforce. We're using public law to uphold private rights, while private rights drift into new territory without any regulation or control. Pastor suggests that there are a lot of advantages that coding an asset in this way confer. It gives you priority in claims over that asset, and it creates durability for the asset. One of the things she points out is that many major corporations go bankrupt. Unlike Americans who go bankrupt, they simply reorganize. It's a different chapter of bankruptcy law that covers limited liability corporations. They are universal, they are respected everywhere, and it purchases convertibility for your assets. They can be sold for hard currency more or less whenever you want to. And so this is the hallmarks of capital, and it is legally created. She points out in terms of the spread of the code of capital, whether we're talking about trust law, which has moved from land originally into bonds and corporate shares in the 20th century, now into mortgage pools and derivatives in the 21st century. In bankruptcy law, originally it's used to protect bonds. Now it's used to protect derivatives and what are called repo agreements, agreements to pay somebody something for something they haven't even given you yet, right? And finally, patents that started out protecting concrete material inventions have moved into intellectual property and genetic modification now. So that in all of these respects, you look area of law by area of law, more and more assets are being coded as capital. And she suggests that this is incompatible both with the idea of democratic law, because the law is opaque, and the rule of law as such. Under the rule of law, we're all supposed to be equal under the law, but it turns out that to tap this area of law, you need a very high-paid lawyer or probably a whole law firm working for you, and that most of us simply can't afford this, and so most of us don't have access to these kinds of advantages. Finally, in terms of thinking again about how the law is complicit in creating the level of inequality that has angered so many Americans, in disempowering us vis-a-vis our own work and the economy as a whole. I'm going to focus for a moment on a concept that I don't think I spoke enough about last week, and that is that we're in an extractivist phase of capitalism. And one of the ways that this term is used, I know it's a neologism, apologies for the jargon, but it's to get at the idea that the average American lives on debt. And we've talked about this before: student loan debt, mortgage debt, credit card debt. It has become impossible to afford the standard of living most Americans think of as typical and required of them without contracting significant debt. And because bankruptcy law was reformed 20 years ago, roughly, the ability of an average consumer to shed debt if they find themselves in deep financial trouble has been substantially restricted. And so this debt is then enforced, consolidated. People find themselves with liens on their income, their paycheck, right, taken at 10% of it, 20% of it before they even have a chance to cash it. And this has become actually extremely profitable. One of the main mechanisms via which the financial sector generates its profit. We've talked before about the way in which bailouts let private owners make profit, but then when they get in trouble, allow the government to bail them out so that they are exempt from the losses that they might have otherwise incurred, the privatization of gain and the socialization of losses, this is called. We've talked about the way in which international trade treaties have allowed large corporations to go wherever they want to write their contracts, to evade the regulations of the area they're actually working in, their home base, their headquarters, how unionization has been made more difficult, the way in which government benefits are worth a lot less, and then again, the final, I think, note of outrage here is that when we faced similar circumstances a century ago, and this is where we're going in terms of the New Deal, there was this tremendously creative, concerted effort to use public policy as a tool to address vulnerability and inequality. And in the 21st century, we have done very little to assist so many Americans who are struggling under the burdens that this new political economy has generated for them. Now, I'm not going to cover all of this today, I promise, but this is really just to point back to other things that we've talked about together in the past, and to point out that although the inequality, the unfairness, the spread of precariousness, the lack of dignity and agency associated with work is one main source of anger, grievance, alienation, and mistrust in our politics in the 21st century, it's not the only source. And so a second source is the rapid demographic shift that has occurred in our society, where we are rapidly on our way to having no single racial majority, and where we have had recently an African American president. We now have a biracial vice president, and the idea that this threatens some people's sense of belonging and perhaps privilege, and that many people are angry and mistrustful about this. They feel like the government is actually privileging the demands of others, that they are focused on remedying racial injustice or immigration or gender injustice, but not the injustice of the erosion of the wages, the wealth, and the belonging of white working class Americans. A third source of mistrust and alienation has to do with the fact that our culture is shifting very rapidly, that the majority of Americans shift religions over their lifetimes, that the largest growth of religious belonging now is the so-called nones, none of the above, right? So that I don't belong to any organized religion, that we're now a society in which gay marriage is legal, and that many young people consider themselves to be gender fluid or not appropriately categorized under the sexual identity and gender of their birth, and that many Americans find this to be disorienting, and there's a sense of anarchy. The center, the cultural and moral center of our world is not holding. Now, with regards to these two sources of mistrust and alienation, I want to say that they are unjust, that it is appropriate as we become a more diverse society that we afford full and equal rights to all racial groups. I take it that is obvious, that the change in the culture that is represented under the idea of post-traditionalism represents for many people a remarkable emancipation from inherited gender, sexual stereotypes and norms that radically constrained their possibilities for freedom and well-being. And so we should, in fact, welcome these changes, but we should also recognize that the period in which these changes occur is going to be a period in which people who are more traditional, more conservative, more status and secure are going to find these changes to be threatening, and that experience of threat is going to be radically amplified if we also have widespread inequality, the shattering of expectations on the part of middle-class Americans, that socially generated status anxiety is going to amplify cultural anxiety. And so let us focus on what we can do about what justice does demand, which is that we build a more equal society, a society in which there's less economic vulnerability, and in which people feel they have more agency, more power to influence their economic prospects, both in terms of the wealth and income that they get, and in terms of their agency within their workplace. So, having said all of that, the final thing worth noting in terms of the background here is that we now have a political party that has become primarily viable electorally as a vehicle for the anger, grievance, anxiety, and alienation that is racking our society as a result of the changes we've just been looking at. Of course, I'm talking about the Republican Party and the way in which it is increasingly attacking the mainstream institutions, the very foundations of our democracy, whether that is elections, whether that is the press, whether that is the ability to trust shared knowledge, right? And so this then leads us to the question, if we're going to address this, we need to build a better economy for the 21st century. The fact that the Republican Party has become an anti-establishment, populist, borderline authoritarian party is going to make this much more difficult in the 21st century. But please note, it wasn't easy in the 19th or the 20th century either. Part of what those of us who want to defend democracy and justice within our economy have to do is start coming up with more plausible alternatives to the contemporary political economy and vigorously defending them. And so we spoke together last week, and I'll review this just very briefly, that in order for democracy to succeed, we need accountable political power, and that means we need to break up large concentrations of wealth and intergenerational advantage that tend to undermine democratic equality of citizens. It also means that we need to overcome historical status subordination, whether this is in terms of race or gender or nationality. This is incompatible with democracy, incompatible with economic justice, and the evidence is absolutely clear that our economy continues to reproduce these axes of inequality, in fact, to amplify them over time. We need to obviously address economic insecurity and excessive social inequality. This undermines solidarity, trust, cooperation, and well-being. And so we need to limit inequality to a bounded and healthy range that doesn't produce those results. We are a rich society, and precisely for that reason, people are not just satisfied with any work. They want good work. They want work that is compatible with respect for their dignity, that treats them as participants in a cooperative enterprise in society, that has prospects for advancement and respect within it. And that's the Diego Rivera image of the way in which he viewed the average working person a century ago. We need to get back to a good jobs economy, an economy with economic freedom and agency for individuals. People also require a work-life balance. I think this is obvious, especially in light of the time we spent talking together about the care crisis over the last couple months. We're finding it increasingly difficult to do everything our work requires of us. We're working about 20% more hours in the 2020s than we were working in the 1960s, and yet we have more care responsibilities. Our children require more cultivation. Our parents are living longer. We are stuck trying to balance all of this, and it's really hard to sustain. We're stretched very thin. And so we need to think not only about good jobs, but jobs that limit their demands on us so that we can do the other things that matter to us as well. Furnishing care is just an illustration of the kinds of things we need or want to accomplish with our leisure time. We obviously also need an environmentally sustainable economy. And then finally, we need to be attentive to the fact that ours is a globally integrated economy. We can't simply purchase all of the above by externalizing our problems onto other societies. We have to be attuned to international or global economic justice as well as domestic justice. So this then brings home the idea that a political economy for the 21st century isn't just an economic issue. It is an issue of social justice. It's an issue of democracy. It's an issue of environmental justice as well. It affects every other aspect of our society. Finally, last week we talked about neoliberalism, and here I'm going to be very brief because I want to get to the New Deal. That neoliberalism is the term that's often used, especially by the people who don't like it, for the period from 1980 to 2020, in which the government became much less involved in the economy, whether through regulation or taxation. This idea that less government is better government, and that therefore we are going to pull back on those fronts has been central to economic policy, both Republican and Democratic, for most of the last 40 years. This has coincided with and enabled really important structural transformation of our economy. In this society and many other advanced economies, we are no longer primarily industrial economies. We've stopped manufacturing goods as the major source of profit, and we've moved into a financialized economy, a service economy, an economy that produces entertainment goods, and into a globally integrated form of capitalism where we allow the production of industrial goods, low-skilled labor to occur primarily elsewhere, places with lower labor costs. This has coincided also with a rapid rise in inequality. I don't need to review this. We've talked extensively about this, and a rise of unfettered consumer culture, what is sometimes called compensatory consumption. I'm not very happy with my work. It's not paying me very well. It's not treating me with dignity, but at least I get to buy a new phone, a new car, a new TV, and get some compensation, right, in that way. But I think, frankly, most people are finding, first, that this rings hollow, and second, that the debt that they contract in order to participate in compensatory consumption ultimately comes back to bite them. That's the next point: systematic reliance on debt, and then coerced repayment as a new form of extracting profits, assets, income for financialized firms. And finally, we think differently about the economy in light of the neoliberal revolution. Whereas in the 1950s and 1960s, we were inclined to think that large firms had unfair power and that the government and unions needed to have the backs of workers to equalize the playing field and give workers a chance at a decent wage, a decent level of living. In the 21st century, we tend to think of this much more individualistically, right? Each of us is on our own. A firm is just a firm. We are just a worker. And so we've become suspicious not only of governments, but also of unions, of solidarity, of power-based analysis of the economy. There have been profoundly important social, economic, and political consequences to the shift to neoliberalism. We are much less solidaristic as a society. The reasons we work are much more coercive as opposed to cooperative in the 21st century. We have dismantled social safety nets and then shifted the responsibility for dealing with economic problems on to individuals. We have lost the sense that the government, the state, and ultimately the practice of democracy through which we populate those institutions with elected representatives can have any influence over the economy. And this, I think, is a fundamental problem that a 21st century democratic political economy needs to address. How do we reassert democratic control over the economy? And we are accustomed to crises, right? We had a 30-year period from the end of the Great Depression through the late 1960s, early 1970s, where we didn't have any major economic crisis. We are now much more accustomed to economic crises being severe and long-lasting again. We've returned to the more volatile period of the late 19th, early 20th century, and a lot of discontent over this economic situation has been channeled, especially by populists, into anger at, and then you can fill in the blank, racial minorities, immigrants, liberals, elites, mainstream political institutions, the press, the deep state. And so we're increasingly in the dangerous territory of populist reactionary politics taking hold in light of all of the above. Now, to conclude for today, I want to contrast two stories about the last time we faced circumstances like this. I'm going to start with Robert Putnam, and Robert Putnam's The Upswing in its introduction starts with a very clever device. He gives a long description of a political situation in which we're polarized, an economic situation in which we are highly unequal, a social situation in which we are fragmented, a cultural situation in which we are individualistic, alienated, and mistrustful. And then he says, oh, and by the way, the situation I'm talking about is the late 19th century, not the 21st century, even though it sounds an awful lot like the 21st century. And then he points out that in the first third of the 20th century, political forces took hold that ultimately allowed for reshaping all of that into a much different kind of society. And so this is the book, The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. And clearly he's interested in doing this in the 21st century as well. And so Putnam suggests that actually four changes or four realms of society changed Simultaneously, our economics, our politics, our society, and our culture all went from being more individualistic and competitive, unequal, fragmentary, narcissistic, into being more equal, cooperative, cohesive, and solidaristic. And this is then the narrative that suggests essentially the New Deal was a success. And this is what we should try to do, as the title suggests, again. And so very quickly, right, the overall synopsis of the evidence that Putnam deals with, and he's a very gifted an analyst, someone who converts interesting social trends into data so that we can analyze them using the tools of quantitative political science. The big story here is, right, in each of those four dimensions, in economics, politics, society, and culture, we went from being a more unequal, competitive, fragmentary, individualistic society at the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, to being the opposite, more equal, more cooperative and bipartisan, more solidaristic, caring for each other, and a society in which we spoke more in the first person plural, the we voice, as opposed to the first person singular, the I voice, but that all of this came undone in the second half of the 20th century, and especially from the 1960s into the 2020s. And Putnam suggests, right, just looking at this economically for a moment, that the big picture here is one of great inequality in the original Gilded Age, much more confined inequality during the so-called Great Compression of incomes, and then a return to almost identical levels of inequality by the time we get to the current decade. Similarly, with the distribution of wealth, though we have not quite returned to the savage inequalities of wealth of the early 20th century. And he suggests that there are straightforward policy implications for this. For instance, the progressivity of federal income taxes and the rate of the corporate tax. And that if we want to return then to where we've been, we can reprise these same policy tools. I'm going to just for a moment, because I am running out of time, give you a sense of where I want to go, because this is the second narrative. And here I'm going to draw on some really important, really influential work. I especially like the book Democracy Against Domination by Sabeel Rahman, but also Ira Katznelson's very important historiography of the New Deal, Fear Itself, and Daniel Rogers of Princeton. Rahman is currently in the Biden administration. I'll speak more about that next week. Katznelson is at Columbia University, Daniel Rogers at Princeton, and all of them do more balanced, critical historiography of the New Deal. And what they suggest is, yes, the New Deal hit the high watermark of equality in the middle of the 20th century, but we can't neglect the people it left out, racial minorities and women. And we can't neglect the fact that in essence, it embraced limited goals for political economy, securing economic growth, and then trying to address inequality through redistribution, and that this was in many ways a displacing and narrowing of more radical economic demands that came out of the period prior to the New Deal, the progressive populist politics of the late 19th and early 20th century, and that it opened itself up to the neoliberal critique precisely by turning these policy goals over to experts who were insulated from democratic political influence. And so, as opposed to saying the New Deal solved our problems and our problems have come back to roost because the New Deal was dismantled, this group of scholars says actually the problems that we face in the 21st century American political economy reflect the limits and weaknesses of the New Deal. And so that's where I'll pick up next week in order to be able to put us in a situation to ask, as we think about economic reform in the 21st century, to what degree should we be thinking about doing again what we did in the middle of the 20th century, and to what degree do we need to set new objectives? I look forward to seeing you all in person again next week. Take care and see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.